Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Um, Today we will be talking about James Baldwin's short story Sonny's Blues, and I will just start by talking about his biography, and then we'll discuss some themes um, that's sort of used throughout the story. Right, so James Baldwin was an American novelist, right, a playwright, an essayist, a poet, and he was also a known activist, right. He was born August 2nd, 1924, and died December 1st, 1987, at the age of 63, right. So died 1987, and so he was very active during the 60s, right, during the um, civil rights movement here in America. And he's known for sort of his activism during that time, right? In his literature, but also as someone who went out to the protests and made speeches and talked to journalists about race issues in America, right? If you go to YouTube, you can actually find a lot of interviews with him about his sort of like political about race and sort of politics, right? So he's very active during that time. Um, but in the literary side, right, he's known as a novelist, a playwright, an essayist, and a poet, right? And he's written collections of essays, right? One is Notes of a Native Son. There's also another one called The Fire Next Time, right? And has written a lot of short stories, and he also wrote um, novels, right? One of which is Giovanni. It's called Giovanni's Room, right? Um, and and so James Baldwin was also, I'm not sure if he came out, like when he came out, but he was also known as a gay activist, right? And so during the gay liberation movement, right? Also, just after, um, or just after the beginning of the civil rights movement, right? He was also very active. He himself was a gay man, right? Um, and and so Giovanni's Room was, I think, his first story where he featured a gay character. Right, the main character is gay, and the story is about um, his life in Italy, I think, and his sort of like relationship with men, specifically with a bartender that he fell in love with, um, named Giovanni. Right. So yeah. So he's a very accomplished writer and a very accomplished activist. Right. And he's also gotten a lot of shit um, for his I guess for his radical ideas. Radical at that time, maybe not so radical anymore today, but very radical ideas during that time, and specifically about race issues and gender and gay issues, right? So it's also accounted in one of his essays, right? How um, he realized that he was gay and he was attracted to men when he was a teenager, and um, at that time, right, it was sort of like bad enough to be black in America and be discriminated for being black, right? And then he realizes that he was also gay, and that sort of added to, I guess, to the suffering, right? Because homosexuality was not only sort of looked down on in in uh, white society, but also in black society, right? And so he had this sort of, you know, double kind of. features that sort of perpetuated and sort of added to his suffering, right? Um, and there was this sort of one experience where he walked into a restaurant, right, and he was denied service, right, for being black, and um, and he sort of took a glass water bath or a glass um, a glass of water, right, and threw it on the wall out of anger, and and that sort of moment, that moment of frustration, right, led him to think about sort of leaving, right, leaving America, and and which he did, right. Eventually, I think a couple of years after that, or a few years at 24, I think, he left America to go to Paris, right? And Paris at that time, or not just at that time, right, but throughout history, Paris has been known as this refuge for a lot of writers who feel like they don't belong in their own countries, right? Um, uh, for whatever reason, right? For being black, for being gay, for being a woman, right? So like Paris has been sort of this space, especially for artists and writers, right, where they felt sort of that they have a community, right, a community of outcasts, if you will, and um, right, where they feel like there are people there that can support them, and sort of the city itself, right, I guess is not very not very conservative. They're sort of open to different kinds of people being there, and so these artists, right, are known to want to live in Paris, right? Because for that reason, in the 20s, for example, right, and that history goes way back, right? But specifically in the 20s, after World War II, or no, after World War One, right? World War One is in 1917, so in the 20s, um, Gertrude Stein. She might not be familiar to you, but she's a very well known poet in Paris. She was an American. She was a lesbian, right? And she felt like she couldn't be openly gay in America, so she moved to Paris um, and uh, had a relationship with another woman there, and she did her art, right. But she was also sort of this, because her family was rich, right, so she became sort of like a patron for artists and writers, right, like Ernest Hemingway, Fitzgerald, even Pablo Picasso, Matisse. um, I think Salvador Dali was also in that group, right? And so all of these artists sort of like gathered. She would host dinners and lunches, right, for all these artists, right? And then she was also an art critic, and so she would give them she would give them her sort of advice, right, and guide them, and she was known for being brutally honest, right. If she didn't like your writing, if she didn't like your art, she will just tell you off, right. And and yeah, so Gertrude Stein sort of created this sort of space in the 20s in Paris, right, um, for not only Americans, right, but Picasso and Dali were from Spain, right, and so people from different sort of um, places who um, and Picasso at that time, his art was very abstract, right, and it was not sort of a lot of people didn't really see abstract art as real art, right? And so these artists were very much ahead of their time, right? And that's why they feel like they can freely sort of operate in that way in Paris, because Paris was also very progressive, right? And not just in terms of being open to people of different races and different genders and sexualities, right? But also open to different artistic ideas, right? And so that sort of Paris has been known for that, and so after the 20s, right, there were still a lot of people, a lot of Americans specifically, and a lot of Black Americans, um, musicians, writers, right, and who then moved to Paris because they felt like they could do in Paris what they can't do in America, right? And James Baldwin, right, was one of those people who sort of found that refuge in America, in Paris, right? But then eventually, right? So he lived in Paris and did his art and did his poetry and literature and art criticism, right? Um, and but then he couldn't sort of cut himself off from America, right? Because obviously that's his sort of roots. He has family there. He comes from a big family. He he's sort of so he was the only child between his biological parents, right? But then after he was born, his father was very abusive, and so his mother left. Um, and 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 sort of had another family with another man, right? Where she had 8 more children, right? And so there were 9 of them, right? And sort of 8 um, step siblings, right? For Baldwin, and so yeah, and so he had a very big family, and he was also um, his stepfather was also somewhat abusive to him, right? And that was also another reason why he felt very disillusioned in America, because society, right, was very abusive to him as a black man and as a gay man. I don't think he came out when he was in America, right? But he was sort of feeling all of these things. Um, but also at home, right? The stepfather was abusive towards the mother and towards him, right? Because he was the only one, or he was the only child, right? That was not his, and so it's said in his biography that the stepfather was even more abusive towards him, right? And so all of these things, right, uh, collectively created all of that sort of suffering and anger, right, inside of him. And I think that sort of that suffering and that anger, right, we can see very much in Sonny, right, in the story, and and I think that's where he sort of gets a lot of that emotion, right. Right. So as I was saying, right, he moved to Paris when he was 24, but then during um, the sort of the peak of the civil rights movement, right, late 50s, early 60s, right. He decided to come back to America, right, because he felt like um, he needed to be a part of this, and he felt like even though he escaped America and he sort of potentially has, you know, was having a better time, I guess, and had more freedom, right, in Paris. Um, he felt like his country sort of still needed him, and he needed to sort of be part of the civil rights movement. And so he came back to America and became very active politically. Right, he was very sort of well known in Hollywood. Uh, he befriended a lot of big name actors like Marlon Brando was a very good friend of his. They even lived together at one point. Robert Kennedy um, was also a very good friend of his, right? And so he had a lot of sort of connections in politics in Hollywood and in the literary world, right? So he used all of that, right, um, uh, to really sort of um, I guess to give voice, right, um, to give voice, I guess, for himself. But he was more so kind of like worried about the young black men who will then sort of inherit whatever the result of the civil rights movement would be, right? And that's something, right, that's a theme in Sonny's Blues, right, is how sort of the suffering, right, of the black man, right, gets sort of like passed on, right, because of that sort of um, because of the institution, right, of racism. um, and so there is a sense in which that destiny is drawn, right? And that's something that Baldwin sort of wants to disrupt, right? And as you notice in the story, right, he talks a lot about how these black boys, right, will eventually turn into this because in his experience he knows he knew another black man who also had the same experience, right? So all of these things that seem to determine their destiny, right? That was something that he really wanted to disrupt, right? Okay, so that's just a little context, right? There's so much to talk about James Baldwin because he's also written a lot about his life, his experience, right? And so his life is sort of an open book, right, so to speak. Um, and so yeah, if you have the time, kind of and if you decide to write about this story, you'll want to really look for other um, other writings, right, by him, just to kind of like inform you better. Yeah, so let's just kind of jump into the story, right? I think the story is pretty straightforward, right? The narrative, I think, is pretty straightforward, um, and but what I think is really important, right? There's so much kind of emotion, right, that gets delivered here, like in the dialogues, in the descriptions, right? And that's that to me is the more interesting sort of part of this story, right? Right, and so we the story begins, right, with this unnamed narrator who is also Sonny's brother, right? Um, he is not named, I don't think, throughout the book. He's just referred to as the brother, right? And he is a mathematics teacher, right? And it looks like he's a teacher in a mainly sort of like a black school, right? I think most of his students, if not all of his students, are black, right? And so that's also an important detail there. Um, so the brother, right, opens the paper and sees that Sonny has been arrested, right, for heroin use, right, and this arrest, right, sort of this scene sort of triggered a lot of memories for the brother and about him and Sonny and and their family, right, but this also sort of triggered a lot of you know racial sort of anxiety, right? Because the black experience linked to the police being arrested, right, doing drugs. These are sort of um, this is sort of like what they always sort of like try to avoid, right? And it seems like the brother has sort of avoided this, right? It seems like he has sort of you know done well, gone to school, got his degree, and then became a teacher, right? And in some way, sort of um, avoided that sort of fate of being arrested and being sort of involved in drugs and stuff like that. Um, but for his brother, right, Sonny, um, whose destiny, right, who seemed to sort of like fulfilled this destiny of the black man, right, and so that sort of um, created for the brother a lot of anxiety, right, because obviously he didn't want that for his brother, but it happened, right. Um, and then so we get introduced, right, to a seemingly strained relationship, right, between Sonny and his brother, right. And it seems strained because as you notice, they they have a sort of like a very different approach to life, I think. Sonny is sort of more artistic and more sort of um, musical, right? And he doesn't really like a lot of people, right? He sort of idolizes this, musicians like Charlie Parker, right? Um, and he sort of, his world revolves around music and playing music, right? And specifically jazz, right? Um, while the brother, right, is very much concerned about how to sort of provide for the family and sort of typical kind of uh, uh, life hopes and dreams, I guess, right? To finish school, do well at school, become a teacher, have a family, and have children, and this and that, right? So that created a little bit of tension between them because, um, on the one hand, right, Sonny wants his brother to understand why he sort of lives this kind of life, right? And then the brother, right, also wants to understand that Sonny is like that, but then he's also scared, right, that if Sonny sort of gets involved with music, gets involved with jazz, right, that he will sort of eventually be led sort of to this life of drug use and be arrested, right, which is what happened to him, right. And yeah, so we get introduced to the brother, and sort of how how their fate is sort of determined for them, right? Because of and systemic racism is also very much a part of what operates outside, right? So this story is very much is very intimate about the brother, about the brothers, about their family, right? But you also get the sense that there is a larger kind of machine, right? That's operating, right, in the story, right? There's a machine that's sort of dictating, right, how their lives, right, are sort of determined, right? And of course, that is sort of systemic racism that's doing that, right? And and when I say systemic racism, right, that's linked to you know racism in housing, racism in education, racism in the government, racism in the police, right? And all of these sort of institutions, right, are also mentioned in the story, right? So these are sort of like the larger sort of machine that's operating, and then we get the story of the brothers, right? And okay, so on page 19, or page 18, right? Um, so the brother was teaching, and this is why I think he's teaching in a black school, because all right. So top of page 18. Yet it happened, right? So I didn't want to believe that I'd ever see my brother going down, coming to nothing, all that light in his face gone out. In the condition I'd already seen so many others. Yet it happened, and here I was, talking about algebra to a lot of boys who might, every one of them, for all I know, be popping off needles every time they went to the head. Maybe it did more for them than algebra could, right? So yeah, so it seems like he's teaching other black boys too, because he's sort of like see Sonny, right, in these black boys um, whose destiny, right, could very much uh, or could very much be sort of the same as Sonny's, who you know um, who would do drugs and then get arrested, right? Um, so there is that issue of systemic racism, right? That's sort of operating outside of the story, right? Um, but I think what's also important in the story, right, is that it's trying to give, because yeah, there is, it's partly true that the black experience is determined, right, by sort of by systemic racism, right? But it's also true, right, that there is a sort of individual experience sort of happening, um, you know, sort of within the sort of black experience, right? And notice on page 20, right, middle of page 20, the brother says, "Look, don't tell me your sad story." This is the brother is talking to another black man who's friends, I think, of Sonny. Look, don't tell me your sad story. If it was up to me, I'd give you one. Then I feel guilty. Guilty probably for never having supposed that the poor bastard had a story of his own, much less a sad one. And I asked quickly, what's going to happen to him now? Right. So there's this desire, right? Um, there's this desire for the story. There's a desire in the narrator, right, to sort of to to understand within the black experience, right, that there is also individual stories, and he tries to be sympathetic, right, to this sort of to these different experiences, right. Um, then let's move to page 24, right. Um, bottom of page 24. So we drove along between the green of the dark of the park and the stony, lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings. This is after he sort of picked up Sonny from from jail, I think, and then yeah, they were driving back to the brother's house, but then they wanted to stop. Um, Sonny asked him if they could stop in their old neighborhood, or at least go in the direction of their old neighborhood, so that he can kind of get a glimpse of the old neighborhood again, right? Lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings store the vivid killing streets of our childhood. These streets hadn't changed, though housing projects jutted up out of them, now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea. Most of the house in which we had grown up had vanished, as had the stores from which we had stolen, the basements in which we had first tried sex, the rooftops from which we had hurled tin cans and bricks. But houses exactly like the houses of our past, yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we once had been found themselves smothering in these houses, came down into the streets for light and air, and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Right? Those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap. Right. So I think this description has so much going on. Right. Just notice the way that the streets, right, are described. Right. Lifeless elegance, right, of hotels and apartment buildings toward the vivid, killing streets of our childhood, right? So it's a very dark kind of description of the neighborhood here. Um, these streets hadn't changed, right? It's housing projects, right? Jutted out of them, now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea, right? That's a very chilling description, I think. Right. Yeah, and then towards the end of that passage, right, some escaped the trap, most didn't, right? Those who got out left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in the trap, right? So yeah, so presumably, right, the brother and Sonny have sort of escaped, right? They went on their different paths, right? But they somewhat kind of like escaped that neighborhood, right? But um, even though they've escaped, right, they know that a lot of people weren't able to escape. They either did something and was put to prison, or they ended up getting killed, right? Or they ended up getting stuck there in the housing project, right? And so that sort of there is that's something of themselves that's left behind, right? You can kind of think of that as almost kind of like a guilt, right? That you got out, but you know that there's a lot of people who were not able to get out, right? Especially for the brother, right? Since the brother sort of is the more kind of stereotypically successful, right? And so there is a part of him, right, who knows that even though he sort of got out, right, and there's still a lot of people who did not, and it's not their fault, right, because well, obviously they're sort of like operating within this system, right. Okay, and then I also wanted to talk about on page 26, right? Middle of page 26, and this is a description of Sonny now, right? And this was partly because Sonny was the apple of his father's eye, right? All right, let me start in the beginning of the paragraph, middle of page 26. So it always went on like this, but he wasn't ever really as bad as he sounded, not even on weekends when he got drunk. As a matter of fact, he was always on the lookout for something a little better, but he died before he found it. Right, this is talking about Sonny's, their dad. He died suddenly during a drunken weekend in the middle of the war when Sonny was 15. He and Sonny hadn't ever got on too well, and this was partly because Sonny was the apple of his father's eye. It was because he loved Sonny so much and was frightened for him that he was always fighting with him. It doesn't do any good to fight with Sonny. Sonny just moves back inside himself where he can't be reached. Right. Um, and I think that that's important, and that's a theme that gets repeated, right? This idea that Sonny is always sort of going inside of himself, right? And I think that is, if you're someone like Sonny, right, or if you're someone like James Baldwin, who feel like it's very difficult for you to function outside of yourself, right? Because of your race, because of your sexuality, right? Because of your ideas, right? That's different from, what's socially acceptable. Um, if you can function outside of yourself, right, then you sort of like look within, right? It's a way of protecting yourself, to sort of to look or to look inside, but also to keep everything inside, sort of, and to hide inside, I guess, right? And to sort of to keep secrets, right? To be secretive, right? And this sort of like being secretive, right? Is it's not only sort of a way for the individual, right, to sort of to process their grief and their suffering, right? But it's also a way of, right, protecting themselves, right, uh, from outside of themselves, because they don't feel safe, sort of functioning there, right? So that sort of that going inside of themselves is, of Sonny's self, right, is, I think, important. Um, okay, there's just one last passage that I want to talk about. This is on page 35, right? So page 35, um, maybe a third from the top, right? This entire paragraph in the middle, I'm going to read. And this is Sonny, or this is a description of Sonny, right? Sonny and his relationship, right, to music and to sound, right? So, well, I really don't know how they stood it. Isabel finally confessed that it wasn't like living with a person at all. So this is after, so Sonny lived with Isabel is the brother's wife, right? Lived with Isabel and Isabel's family for a little while, and and Sonny liked living there because they had a piano and he would be able to play the piano, right? And so he was just there and doing his thing, making music and stuff like that, and the people around him, Isabel and the other family members, were just kind of there observing him because he was just this. He just gets so wrapped up into his own world and into music, right, and into the sound of jazz. Whenever he's sort of performing, right, that's sort of like his escape, right. Um, so yeah, so this is sort of a reaction to that, right. So, well, I really don't know how they stood it. Isabel finally confessed that it wasn't like living with a person at all. It was like living with sound. And the sound didn't make any sense to her, didn't make any sense to any of them, naturally. They began in a way to be afflicted by his presence that was living in their home. It was as though Sonny were some sort of god or monster. He moved in an atmosphere which wasn't like theirs at all. They fed him and he ate. He washed himself. He walked in and out of their door. He certainly wasn't nasty or unpleasant or rude. Sonny isn't any of those things. But it was as though he were all wrapped up in some cloud, some fire, some vision all his own, and there wasn't any way to reach him. Right. So that is just I don't know. Like it's a very kind of powerful passage because it's hard to know what, like it's describing Sonny, right? But it's hard to know, like, or it's hard to get an idea of Sonny, right, through this description, right? But also it fits Sonny, right? Like Sonny can't be described, right? He's kind of like a sound, right? And sound is very important, right? Because um, sound is often, it's something that is more abstract than language, and so um, it's it, it's hard to understand, right? With language, a lot of times, we articulate something because we want something to be meaningful, to be precise, to be exact, to be true, right? To be factual. Um, and that's why language has a way of being precise, right? um, but then sound, just sound, right, it's more abstract. It's hard to tell what that sound means, right, just by hearing it. And so in that sense it's very much like Sunny, right, where it's hard to sort of um, know what he is, what he wants. It's hard to sort of make sense of his suffering, right. And I think, yeah, sound is a very important part of this story, right? And not just sound also, but jazz music, right? And jazz is particularly important because it has this quality of syncopation, right? Where there is a kind of, in music, like harmony is supposed to be, and I'm not I'm not a very sort of like musical person, but I think I know a little bit, just from whatever, from reading. um, but harmony, right, and the sound sort of like fitting together, right, um, is very important, right, in music. But jazz has this quality, right, of syncopation, where like not fitting perfectly or being displaced, right, the meters being displaced is actually a good thing, right. So that kind of structure of like not quite sort of placing together, not quite harmonizing, right, but it still gives us something beautiful, right. I think that is very important here, right. This sense that maybe Sunny is something that we shouldn't try to make sense of, right? The same way that we can't make sense of sound, but we can't make sense of sort of jazz, right? That it sort of like operates in a different way, right? It shouldn't be sort of, we shouldn't try to understand it based on the standard that we know traditionally, right? It should be sort of understood in a different way, right? And I think, yeah, and if you're interested in music, that's definitely something that you'll probably know more about than I. Um, yeah, that's, it'd be wonderful if you can, write about that in your papers, right? So I think I'll just end there. There's so much still to talk about, but I don't want to sort of, make this lecture very long. So I'll just stop there, and if you have any questions, or if you want to talk to me more about this story, if you decide to write about it, feel free to email me or meet with me through Zoom. All right, thank you.